Today I'll read you a slice of action from this action-packed book, Ocean Warrior, by Captain Paul Watson. This happened off the coast of Siberia in the 1980s, where the Sea Shepherds had been documenting illegal whaling activities and are now being pursued. Suddenly, the VHF radio erupted with a deep voice speaking badly broken English. Sea Shepherd, stop your engines, immediate. I picked up the telephone reluctantly and said, "Stop killing whales." There was a slight pause on the other end, but then the voice returned. Sea Shepherd, stop your engines, prepare to be boarded by the Soviet Union. I answered with a chuckle, "Sorry, we do not have room for the Soviet Union." The Soviet captain responded, sounding a little irritated. Stop your engines now. You are in violation of the laws of the Soviet Union. You are under arrest. This is an order. Mark looked at me and said, "Well, mate, that's it, isn't it? We have to stop now." Mark, the one absolute thing we are not going to do is stop our engines. I've lost one ship to this kind of BS. I'm not about to lose a second. Mark looked alarmed. But what if he threatens to fire? Then we call their bluff. Then what do we do if they do fire? Then they will have an international incident on their hands, and that will surely publicise this illegal whale kill. They won't fire, I'm pretty sure about that. The Russian's voice interrupted us. Sea Shepherd, you are under arrest. I answered the Russians. You are in violation of the regulations of the International Whaling Commission. Your nation is involved in illegal whaling operations. I do not intend to stop this ship, nor will I allow your men to board us. We do not recognise the authority of a pirate whaling nation. The Russian did not answer. Instead, he sped up and raced ahead of us, and then crossed our bows. Some men on the stern were paying out a thick cable with the intention of fouling our prop. We passed harmlessly over it. I radioed the Soviet commander. "Captain, we have a protected prop. That tactic will not work." The Russian did not answer. Instead, he sped ahead once again and then stopped full abeam directly in front of us. "Captain," I yelled into the telephone, "your ship is worth tens of millions of dollars. My ship is worth very little. Please get out of our way or I'll run into you. I have no intention of stopping. I repeat, I will not stop." The distance was closing rapidly. Mark held the wheel steady, but he was obviously frightened. "Mark, don't change course, not even a degree. We cannot be seen to be weakening. I'm not bluffing. He moves or we hit him." The ball was in the Russian's court now. I spoke into the transmitter for the ship's intercom. "Stand by for a ramming. Hold tight and make sure you have your life jacket." Things were unfolding quickly. Everything rested with that Russian captain. He had to assume I was crazy. He had to weigh the cost of explaining a damaged ship to his superiors. He had to be aware of the responsibility he had to his crew and to the property of the state. It was like drag racing when you're a teenager. The guy with a battered old wreck could always take chances that the kid with daddy's fancy sedan could never risk. If we survived the impact, there was the problem of escape, but in that regard, I had the tactical edge. Of course, he had his guns, and there were the armed helicopters overhead. But as it was, our game of chicken was transpiring at breathtaking speed. She was looming closer. From the bridge, I could see very little water separating the two ships. Finally, to our immense relief, the Russian destroyer lurched forward and out of the way, allowing us to pass behind her stern by less than 50 metres. I could sense that her commander was angry now. The warship moved and steamed around us. The ship called Communist fell back. The ship called Iceberg moved back into position on our starboard side. This time, just 20 metres separated us. Soviet sailors were whipping the tarpaulin off deck guns mounted on her bridge deck. I yelled down to the crew, "Stand your ground. Keep smiling, keep waving. Turning to Mark and Eddie, I said, "All we can do now is to confuse them and pray that we survive this." I left my seat in the wheelhouse and stepped outside to look across at the Russians. I could see the sailors loading an ammunition belt and then waiting for orders. This was the moment of reckoning. It looked to me as if the Soviets now intended to rake the deck with 50 caliber machine gun fire and then board us. Other sailors were now preparing 2 launches. The silence over the radio was ominous. No more talking. Then the miracle occurred. If there hadn't been so many witnesses, I wouldn't dare to report this. I'd be in the position of somebody who'd just seen a flying saucer. Who would believe me? But this is what happened. There was a sudden cheer from the deck. It seemed senseless. I thought at first that some of my crew were flipping out. But it wasn't just my crew. The Russians had stopped their attack preparations and they were pointing wildly at the water. For suddenly, without warning, the space between the 2 ships erupted in a shower of water. It obscured our view of the Russian ship for a moment, and then the mist dispersed in rainbow-tinted droplets. My crew continued to cheer wildly. The Soviets looked surprised. A large California grey whale had surfaced between the 2 ships and spouted. It remained for a few moments, then dove beneath the surface. The space between the 2 boats opened as the Soviets turned to starboard and Mark instinctively turned to port. A whale. A glorious, beloved, wonderful whale. Like a hand coming up from the sea between us and the Russians. I shuddered. Nobody who experienced this moment could help but feel that something mystical had taken place. Something beyond the pale of anything we had a rational hope of expecting. Years before, a man who knew more about whales than I ever will told me that if I could ever get my act together enough to get out to sea and go to aid the whales, I could depend on the whales for help. The whales will come to you when you need them, Paul Spong had promised. You can trust them to be there. I'd put the thought aside, preferring to depend on the realpolitik and real economics of making the sea a no man's land for whalers. I would depend on pistons and willpower and ask nothing of nature that Mother Gaia could easily grant. Oh, but by a miracle, here was a whale, a lone California grey whale, coming up out of the water between the warship and ourselves. Just as I had put my body between harpooners and cetaceans, Leviathan now had placed its body between mine and the naval vessel that would have destroyed us. We could not have been more astonished, more awed, if an angel had intervened. Eric raced up to the bridge. "Did you see that? It was incredible." I didn't answer. The Russians were falling behind. One of the helicopters suddenly turned around and a few seconds later it was followed by a second. It was a relief not to have the thudding roar of their engines above us. Eddie was looking into the radar. "We have land up ahead," he shouted. Mark interjected. "It must be St. Lawrence Island." I ran into the chart room and made a few rapid calculations before returning to the bridge. "Gentlemen," I said, "we're safely back in American waters." We, who would shepherd the whales, had been shepherded by a whale through the valley of the shadow of death.